amazing opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, it's 4 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody who is joining this webinar. It's brought to you tonight by Crow Canyon and by the Hisatsinom chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society, our local CAS chapter. The title of tonight's webinar is Hopi History at the Homol'ovi Settlement Cluster, Northeastern Arizona, and it's going to be given by Dr. Chuck Adams. I want to begin with the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledging the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Hickory Apache people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Crow Canyon's mission-related work wouldn't be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Here's a picture of Crow Canyon's campus with Sleeping Ute Mountain in the background and our mission statement, which is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. If you've never checked out Crow Canyon's website, I'd encourage you to do so. That's the address there. You can just type that into a browser. We just went through a long process of redoing that website, and it's loaded with lots of information, a lot of educational materials, and we publish all of our research on that website as well. In terms of the logistics for tonight's talk, you want to reduce the size of the talking heads and then drag that up into the upper corner or over to the side of your screen. You'll probably have a vertical line going through your screen, and you can pull that to the right to maximize the size of the screen and the presentation that Dr. Adams is going to show, and minimize the size of the talking heads. There'll also be a live transcription at the bottom of the talk, I believe. And you can either leave that on, or there's a way to turn that off as well when you click on the transcription. We will take questions at the end of the talk, and it's better to put those, use the Q&A button if you're on Zoom, and you could put them in chat, but they sort of get lost in the chat. So it's better to use the Q&A, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can when Dr. Adams completes his talk. If you're having any difficulties with the Zoom feed for this webinar, you can also stream this live on Crow Canyon's Facebook site. And you can just type that crowcanyon.org /Facebook into your browser, and that will come up. Also, when this is completed by tomorrow, Dylan Schwint, who's running the technical part of this webinar behind the scenes tonight, will publish this on our YouTube channel, and all of our webinars are on there. So they're really good to catch webinars that you missed, or to go back to things that you hear in this one that you want to review again. We're doing these webinars every Thursday. And the next two, the next one is the Maize Database Project, a Hopi Crow Canyon collaboration. And I'm presenting that next Thursday. The Thursday after that is with Winona LaDuke, one of the leading voices in Native America for the last generation. I've heard her speak many times, and she will be amazing. The title of her talk is A Just Transition, and that will be Thursday, November 4th, and you really won't want to miss that. It will be extra special. COVID has really affected all of the Native nations in the Four Corners, and there's ways that you can help those communities. Each of the organizations shown on this slide are doing a great deal to help during these difficult times. There's the Pueblo Relief Fund, the Hopi Relief Fund, the Navajo and Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund, and the official Navajo Nation COVID-19 Relief Fund. So if you're so inclined, your support for these funds that help these communities in many different ways is greatly appreciated. And this is a good example of where you might need to go to the YouTube channel tomorrow. If you don't have something to write down these addresses with, you can go back and review this. It'll be there on the YouTube channel, and you can check out these websites and these organizations that are doing such good work. Well, that brings us to tonight's talk. I want to thank the Hisatsinom chapter for co-sponsoring this with us. It's Hopi history at the Homol'ovi Settlement Cluster, Northeastern Arizona. And Chuck, I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to you.
Oh, okay.
You can share your screen.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you, Mark. And thanks to the Hisatsinom chapter and to Crow Canyon for hosting this seminar or talk. I've been looking forward to it for a while. Also thank Ben Bellarado, who recommended that we get together, the Hisatsinom chapter and me, and we came up with this presentation. Out of the 200 or so of you who are participating in this, I would guess a few of you have been to Homol'ovi, but probably the vast majority of you have not. I will mention that it is a state park in Arizona, and so you can actually go to the visitor center there and go to a couple of the sites. 4 of them are in the state park, and actually visit these places. And from there, if you choose, you can go about 60 miles up the road to the Hopi Mesas to visit the communities who are descendant from the Homol'ovi area. And as you can see, Homol'ovi is a Hopi word meaning mounded up or placed of buttes, which describes the landscape around the area that is Homol'ovi. And to orient you a little bit, this is what the landscape looked like in the 1300s, basically. The Pueblo people, as probably most of you know, left the Four Corners region for the most part and migrated southwest and ended up in many of these settlements. The Homol'ovi settlement is the one that is highlighted in red. And there are about 50 villages or so within these communities, these clusters of sites. I'm going to focus on Homol'ovi, but they had relationships with all the ones surrounding them, either by people migrating into the Homol'ovi area or through exchange. These are the 7 major pueblos that comprise the settlement cluster that is called Homol'ovi. The excavations that I directed over 20 some years actually focused on 5 of them with a little bit of work on Jackrabbit. The only one we didn't work in is Cottonwood Creek. All of the sites are on state land and Arizona state land. And so the collections resulting from this are still at the Arizona State Museum, although accessible to researchers and of course to the Hopi people if they would like to see them. I'm not going to go through every bit of this, but just to give you some idea of the history of work at Homol'ovi, there was, probably everybody knows Jesse Walter Fuchs because he worked pretty much everywhere in the Southwest, including the Mesa Verde area. But in 1896, after spending time up at First Mesa, he learned about these villages down around Winslow, which is where the villages are nearby. And so he came down to look at these ancestral communities. And the Hopi called them Homol'ovi because that's the geographic description of the area. And so he, with his Hopi crew, began looking for these communities. And he found 4 Homolovies. And so as he encountered them, he numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, which is why we have Homolovi 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's from his work. Also, soon after Fuchs was there, the Field Museum in Chicago had an expedition in the Homolovi area. Unlike Fuchs, they did not publish anything about the work that they did there, but both Fuchs and Dorsey amassed huge collections, primarily from working in burials, which are either at the Smithsonian or in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. So there was a 75-year hiatus of really any work done at the Homolovi sites until the Museum of Northern Arizona launched a small project on Homolovi 1 and 2 that I participated in. And this has prompted by and followed later in work by other groups by the serious vandalism that was taking place at these communities. They were basically unprotected. They're very close to Winslow and the railroad. They could be visited at any time. There was no law keeping really people from visiting these sites. So they were being recreationally excavated up into about the 50s, and then professional excavators started decimating these sites in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it was at that time that through Hopi prompting and through lots of archaeologists, communicated to Governor Babbitt the serious nature of the vandalism taking place there. He worked with the legislature of Arizona, and a state park was created in 85 and opened in 86, and then moved to their permanent headquarters in 2001. And then Ray Thompson of the Arizona State Museum got some funds, permanent funds from the state of Arizona, which allowed the Arizona State Museum to conduct excavations there to try to recover some of the information that we feared was going to be completely lost due to the vandalism. So here's a list of the various places we worked over several years. Now some details about the communities. You can see some of these villages are quite large. 2 of them have over 1,000 rooms. Chevron has 500 rooms. So these are very large aggregated sites. They grew rapidly over a fairly short period of time, people coming in from a number of areas, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And the founding of the cluster occurred about 1260 with Homolovi 4, expanded greatly in 1280s and 1290s, and then climaxed about 1400 when the communities were depopulated and most of the people ended up back at Hopi, a few maybe at Zuni as well. Some of the things that archaeologically we learned about the villages and while we were working there are some of the things I want to cover in this talk. And this is pretty much the order I'll be covering them in. Chronology, building, environment, and so on. So we'll just get right into it. Of course, as archaeologists, one of the most important things we do is we have to build a chronology. We have to have some way of putting things in some sort of an order that makes sense in terms of time. In Southwest Colorado, you're extremely lucky in that almost everything dates, tree ring dates. At Homolovi, virtually nothing dates. Lots of cottonwood, which isn't datable. And most of the wood that we found in our excavations was driftwood. A lot of it also didn't date. Because it was driftwood, the dates were not very accurately representative of when the date that they were actually put in place in terms of the roofing. So we had to rely on tree ring dated pottery, which we have lots of, and I'll get into that a little bit. And then the old reliable seriation techniques and stratigraphy to put things at least in a relative chronological order. So I want to talk a little bit about the seriation stratigraphy, and then I'll get back into the tree ring material and the driftwood a little later on. So one of the hallmarks of Hopi archaeology is the manufacture of the yellow pottery. Many of you may have seen at least modern or historic Hopi yellow pottery, because that's what they still manufacture today. This was invented basically about 1325 and became very common in the Homol'ovi villages as it was traded down from Hopi 60 miles, beginning soon after that. And these are typical bowls from a type called Jeddo black on yellow, which spans about a 75-year period at the Homol'ovi sites. Well, what we found in our excavations is that the frequency of yellow pottery of all the decorated pottery in a particular deposit was directly correlated to the depth of stratigraphically of those materials. So through time, the amount of yellow pottery making up the decorated pottery assemblage increased from about, well, zero, probably in 1325, up to about 90% by the 1380s and 1390s. So that, because it correlates directly with stratigraphy, we could use that as a way of substituting for dating deposits on the basis of the percentage of general yellowware. Actual dating of the yellowware pottery was done using tree ring dated ceramics from such as White Mountain redwares, Roosevelt redwares, Cibola whitewares, Tucson whitewares, and things such as this. All things that have a pretty accurate tree ring dates associated with them. So when we find them associated with the deposits having yellowware in it, we were able to then assign pretty accurate dates to the percentages of general yellowware. So this is a stratigraphic column in a kiva from a Chevron. It's about almost 3.5, 4 meters high. On the basis of the percentage of yellowware and the true ring dated ceramics, we can date the deposits in this kiva from showing it was being filled over a period of 45 or 50 years after it was no longer used. Another interesting thing that we discovered in looking at the yellow pottery is that through time, from early on, where a lot of the bowl interior was covered with decoration, that amount of area decreased through time. So in 1325, the bowl up here in the upper right probably dates to that period. As you get later in time, when you look at the one on the upper left and the middle bottom, a lot less area is decorated. And as the decorations focused into the bottom of the bowl, where you can see them more clearly, the line that we call the banding line around them, this dark line, decreased with them. And, that's kind of an obscure thing, but what we discovered when we measured the banding lines and the distance below the rim by groupings associated with percentage of general yellowware, we found that that banding line dropped through time from 5.3 millimeters in the 1325 to almost 19 millimeters in 1400. And, you know, that isn't really particularly hugely helpful to us in dating things, but you can imagine if you are out in the landscape and you come across an assemblage of yellow pottery, and you have enough rim sherds, you could actually use the band line distance from the rim to relatively date within a 25, 30-year period when that assemblage of pottery was likely produced or deposited there. So that's pretty amazing. And this work was done by a doctoral dissertation student of mine, Vince LaMotta, in 2006. So as a result of all the chronological maneuvering we did, we ended up with 4 major phases of occupation at Homol'ovi, Tuyuka, early Homol'ovi, middle Homol'ovi, and late Homol'ovi. Not very imaginative, but workable. So you can see that most of these are around 30, 40, even less years. So it's a pretty tight chronology and almost good as tree ring dating. Next thing I want to talk about is the unique element of the Homol'ovi sites, and that is that they're focused along the Little Colorado River, which is one of the few permanently running rivers that is actually accessible for agriculture, really on the Colorado Plateau. This is the Little Colorado River Basin on the left side, and it shows the river flowing through the center part of it. The Homol'ovi villages are at about 5,000 feet. The Mogollon Rim here is 7,000 to 8,000 feet. And you may or may not be able to read the fine print down here, but there are spruce and Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, pinyon juniper, all sorts of trees, aspen, oak, and things like that grow in these upland areas. And the river, when it floods, transports some of these, the wood that is near the river, all the way down into this area. And this is a detail of the area around the Homol'ovi sites. This is Chevron, Homol'ovi 1, and Homol'ovi 2. One thing you'll note is that the floodplain is really wide here. It's almost 4 kilometers wide near Homol'ovi 1. And it's pretty narrow through this area. What that results in is when the river in flood stage comes through this area, it loses a lot of its energy around in this area, and it drops all kinds of sediment as well as driftwood. And this is just a detail of that area, Homol'ovi 1, 2, 3, and 4. Floodplain, which was used for some types of farming, and then upland areas, which are on the east side of the river, are covered with dunes. On the west side, there's not much going on because the prevailing winds are from the southwest. So it kind of scours this area, picks up sediment out of the floodplain and deposits over here. So the upland area is good for rainfall dependent farming, which can supplement the floodwater farming, floodplain farming rather. Okay, a couple of things we learned about the river in studying records produced by the USGS and the State Land Department, keeping track of stream flows and measurement of stream flows began around 1900 along the Little Colorado. And a couple of things that we noticed while we were there and are documented in the stream flow measurements is that there's annual flooding, usually in early, mid-April, from the snow melt that accumulates in a fairly large catchment area of the Mogollon Rim and the White Mountains. And so that flows through down the Little Colorado into the Homol'ovi area during April. And of course, the people living there were very aware of this and could prepare for that in terms of getting the floodplain to receive increased water transport. Also, usually every year there were regional floods involving the monsoons, which everybody's familiar with in the Southwest. And when you're in the Homol'ovi area, you can see the clouds building on the Mogollon Rim and in the mountain areas. And sometimes incredibly heavy storms occur. And these floods, these increased stream flows take 1 or 2 days to get from the mountain areas through the Homol'ovi area. So that's another thing that local residents would have known. And when the heavy monsoons began to build, they could have planned again for water, extra water coming down. So Homol'ovi farmers could plan for these surges. And what we think they primarily used was what's called recision farming, which is the flood waters spread out over the floodplain, which again is up to 4 kilometers wide. And then they would just build dams behind that to keep the water from receding, or a very simple, efficient way to catch water. And the water can cover a wide area in some of these large floods. We also know that from the gauges that about once every 7 years, there are very large flood events. And I'll show you one in the slide in just a second. And these bring driftwood and soil. I mentioned that a little earlier, where the widening of the floodplain occurs near Homol'ovi 1. And so a lot of that is deposited in that area. And we witnessed one of these events in 1993, and I'll talk in detail about that in the next few slides. During our excavations, we've recovered a lot of wood because the Homol'ovi villages are not very old. They're only 600 years old. It's a very dry climate. It's very sandy soil, so moisture flows through it quickly. So we got a lot of wood. Very little of it was datable, but we sent it into the tree ring lab to get species identification because we were curious. And a lot of it came back as non-local. And I'll have a summary of that in just a second. So this is what the Little Colorado typically looks like. If you're a good long jumper, you could probably clear it. In 1993, however, and many other times since we've been working there, this is what the river looked like in February and January of 1993. The river was about a mile wide. So huge flood events can occur. They occur regularly. Through the stream gauges, we know they occur about every 7 years. And it's not the greatest photo, but this is driftwood piles actually lying on the top of Homol'ovi 1 in the lower part of the village. And these are the species of wood that have been recovered from our excavations in these various villages. And this is the summary of them. So subalpine would be spruce trees or fir trees. Mountain conifer would be mostly ponderosa pines. Conifer woodland would be pinyon juniper. Local riparian is cottonwood. So this is how they break down. 16% of the site of the wood is from the subalpine area, an area that is at least 50 miles, if not farther away. So we were curious how closely the driftwood might track what we're finding in these sites. So we sampled one of these driftwood piles, several hundred pieces of it, And we came up with this, we did transects through it. So that it was, just every piece in the transect. And these are the frequencies we came up with. Now, they aren't exactly the same as the sites because, of course, people at the sites were selecting things. But it suggests that the people at Homol'ovi were relying on driftwood to build their pueblos rather than walking 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 miles like the Chaco people did to collect their wood for their rooms. I notice also the two early sites, Homol'ovi 3 and 4, dating to the late 1200s, they are mostly cottonwood. And that's because when the people moved there in the 1260s and 70s and 80s, the floodplain was full of cottonwood trees. And so they just simply used those for their wood. But as that resource was exhausted, they began to use the driftwood piles and wood in the piles. Also, driftwood piles came during flood events, so they weren't always available. A couple of other things that we did. These are flood events that have occurred along the Little Colorado River, and the size of them, the year, or the specific date. 70,000 cubic foot per second, 50,000 cubic per second flood events. These are dates that we got off of pieces of wood off the driftwood pile that date to the post gauge, river gauge emplacement. And what I tried to show here is that there is a relationship between dates that we get from driftwood and flood events. And the year correlation is how many years different there is between the driftwood dates and the flood dates. Now, keep in mind that the dates on the driftwood are not necessarily cutting dates. In fact, most of the time they are not, because the outside is lost as it tumbles down the river. But it's interesting that we have some very strong correlations as we get closer in time. And this suggests that if we get dates off of ancient wood, that it might at least tell us that there was a flood event somewhere within a decade or two of the date that we got off of that prehistoric sample. So here, we have prehistoric tree ring dates that off of about, I think we had 19 dates that we got. And the difference between the dates from the one before to the next one, and giving us an average of about 9 years between possible flood events, which is very close to what we find historically. Also, we have actually bark rings, or the last ring on some of these samples are very close to it, suggesting that somewhere around 1276, there was a flood event. And so the prehistoric tree rings suggest that they can be used for dating past flood events. And these are some of the possibilities. Somewhere in the, after 1276, maybe after 1285, somewhere in here in the late 1200s, there was a pretty substantial flood event. And I note in here also that that's when we see groups moving into the area. Another way that one can reconstruct stream flow is through regression analysis of the width of tree rings by comparing it to known stream flows and the width of the rings. And the Tree Ring Lab has done this. And so these are the dates, these are the ones, the historic flood events and the standard deviations. This summarizes the standard deviation, and the higher the number, the greater the flood event. So using this method, that's projected that in 1275, there was a medium flood event. In 1358, there was a medium flood event. And in the early 1380s, there were two very large flood events. Note that this 1275 flood event correlates very closely with the dates that we're getting from the trees, tree rings. So I think we have a pretty good case that somewhere in the 1270s, 1280s or so, there was a major flood event, and that's when 5 of the 7 Homology villages were founded. 1358, another smaller flood event, that Homology 2 was founded just about that time as well. So to summarize, we have learned from studying this driftwood file that the Homology occupants did not get their long distance wood for construction and fuel by traveling to it, that it was brought to them by the river in the form of driftwood. We've also discovered that tree ring dates of modern driftwood correlate to historic flood events, indicating ancient driftwood dates can probably correlate to ancient flood events. And we've seen this from the previous 2 tables. And then the historic tree ring record can also be used to predict the past flood events. So what we've been able to do is correlate flood events on the Little Colorado River and human behavior, and most specifically, probably the founding of several of the villages, and possibly with those 1380 flood events, maybe the beginnings of the leaving of the Homology villages as well. So just quickly, we have these 7 villages, and they weren't, although they were, probably somewhat autonomous villages, they were clearly connected to one another. They were an average of about 5 or 6 kilometers apart. They were all linked by the river, shared resources from the river. We have clear indications of what can be called mother and daughter villages. This is the way the Hopi think of villages. The mother village is the primary village, the largest. It has all the religious ceremonies stationed there, and the daughter villages are dependent on the mother villages. And this is a history of the cluster. 1260, it was founded with Homology 4. Talked a bit about the 5 villages that were founded in the 1280s. Homology 3 stopped being occupied primarily because it was probably flooded out. It was right in the floodplain in the early 1300s. And then one final village was founded, Homology 2, we think about 1360. Depopulation of the cluster began in the 1370s or early 80s, and the last 3, the largest villages, people left about 1400. So one of the interesting things that we discovered in abundance at several of the Homology villages were form molded adobes. You also get a few of these actually in cliff dwellings in the Four Corners area. You may or may not be aware of that. For the longest time, and historians believed that form molded adobes were introduced to the Pueblo people by Spaniards in the early 1600s. And we can see in many of the New Mexico pueblos that were built afterwards, they were made of form molded adobes. But those adobes have straw in them and other material. What we found is that at Homology, and we have form molded adobes beginning as early as 1300. And what we discovered through a couple of master's thesis and additional further research, adobes are going to be where they're found where there's enough water to spare to make them, because if you need water to drink and you're not going to be wasting on making adobes. Experiments that we did suggest that stone slabs were used as forms. The adobes that we have found are uniform in width and height, but vary a little bit in length. Usually they're the same length in the room, but from one room to room, they may vary a little bit. And so one of the questions is, why use adobes? Well, first of all, your stone source may be farther away than your mud and water source. You can also control the size of adobes to exactly what you need instead of having to beat on a rock to get it the size. So in many ways, they're much easier to work with. At Homol'ovi, the largest construction of adobe bricks occurred at Homol'ovi 1, mostly built after 1350 and involved maybe as many as 300 rooms. We also found adobes at Chevron and Homol'ovi 3. So this entire room block, this is Homol'ovi 1, that surrounds this large plaza. Almost every one of these rooms is made of adobes, and this is a plan view of it to give you another sense of what it looks like. And this is one of these form molded adobes. We showed these adobes to adobe makers in the Tucson area, the original prehistoric adobes, and they identified a number of characteristics on it that to them indicated that they were form molded and not hand molded. Here's a couple of walls made out of these adobes. Here is a collapsed wall that we've sectioned to give you an idea of what these adobes look like. So another thing I should note is that the footers of these are all stone. That was learned pretty quickly to keep water from transporting from the ground up into the adobes. The stone blocked that. So we have a lot of rooms, two-story rooms that are made of adobes. And the adobe bricks in some cases are in better shape than the stone that we recovered from some of the walls at Homol'ovi. Another thing that we were able to record is a number of examples of major village planning. These involved rapid construction of the village of Homol'ovi 2 using a concept of what's called ladder construction. Raising the level of the South Plaza at Homol'ovi 1, the one we were just looking at, where the adobe brick rooms are. And similar to Homol'ovi 2, the design and construction of the Great Plaza at Chevron, also using ladder construction. Each of these were large, complex building events that required a lot of planning and community involvement, indicating that there was ability to organize fairly large-scale labor in these communities to accomplish these important projects. So if you're not familiar with ladder construction, this is how it's done. It's used to build room blocks quickly and at the same time. So the outer wall here in solid black is constructed first, and then the inner walls are built abutting the previously built exterior walls, and they're usually equally spaced. They don't have to be, but they usually are. And this is flexible to be any size you want. It can be 6 rooms like here, or it can be 50 rooms. And because it looks kind of like a ladder, the term ladder construction is often used to refer to it. And these are examples from LeBlanc's warfare in the American Southwest, prehistoric warfare, of these ladder constructions. LeBlanc argued that these were important, and then they would be for defense, but they're also important for just constructing large room blocks when you have fairly large numbers of people migrating into a community. And they can be made 2 stories. So this is an example of what it might look like with rapid construction planning. So this is a good example of ladder construction. This is Homol'ovi 2. And this is basically a planned community. There are spines of 2 or 3 rooms wide and all these long room blocks. And then rooms might be added to them later on. But there is, here we have 2 rooms wide. So these were all built generally at the same time. And this community was built in a matter, we don't know how long, certainly a few years at the most. And it has 1,200 rooms. By the way, the colored areas are where we did our excavations. This is what a 3D model of the village would look like, the western and central plazas. This plaza, by the way, covers an acre. And it's in the plazas that the kivas are situated. This is another example. This is the great plaza, Chevron Pueblo, which has 500 rooms. This is the early village here. And then around 1350 or so, they decided they wanted to build a giant plaza. And so they built long, 2-room wide, for the most part, room blocks. One of these, I think it's, I can't remember which one it is, but it's 46 rooms altogether, 23 rooms long, probably this one. The other one is close to that. So these could have, again, been built in a very short period of time to create this space for not really protection, because they didn't connect it to the rest of the pueblos. So if defense was the purpose, it probably wouldn't get the job done, but it certainly creates a space for the community to use. This is a kiva, by the way. And then the other kind of remarkable planning construction is the raising of this entire area underneath this southern room blocks, primarily made of adobes. This part was raised 1 meter and this part was raised 2 meters. And they did that because the river, which you saw in an earlier slide, flows very close to Homol'ovi 1. And that big flood event deposited driftwood on top of the plaza area in these the room blocks as they were reduced to 1 story. So they were well aware of the flood impacts of this area. So they attempted to mitigate those by raising the entire area to 1 to 2 meters, involving 27,000 cubic feet. And we know this was done because many of the layers that were brought in had trash in them, lots of yellow pottery, so we could date when this took place by the percentage of yellow pottery. And it occurred probably about 1350 or 1360 that they did this. This is one of the more than 1 kiva that was in the plaza. Another thing that we discovered and work in some of the other small villages in the area is that the Pueblo was not occupied. The area was not occupied when the Homol'ovi Pueblos were settled. And this is based on excavations in 2 villages in the state park, on the pottery that were recovered from those excavations. And they predate, in this case, by 30 or more years, the earliest settlement, Homol'ovi 4, and by 50 or 60 years when the rest of the settlements were established. So we argue that basically everybody in the Homol'ovi villages migrated into this area. They're all immigrants. These are where these 2 villages are located, Cresswell and what we call Site 36, Pit House Village, Cresswell Pueblo. This is what Cresswell looked like. It was dominated by brownware, which indicates that the occupants probably came from the south or east of the Homol'ovi area, in contrast to the Pit House village, which is just a couple of kilometers away, which is dominated by Little Colorado and Tucson gray wares, which indicates that the people primarily came from the north. Structure 9, this is just an example of the pit houses that they occupied versus the Pueblo that was occupied by people from the south. Loom holes, fire pit, ventilator, might have even been also used as a kiva. So where do people come from? We can learn this from what we call technological style, communities of practice, with the realization that people learn how to do things from their community, from the people they're living with or are in the same community. So pottery, we can look at pottery, kivas, rooms, are all examples of things that have a rhythm to them that is unique to the groups who are making them, that is passed along. This is a pottery style called Genital Black and Orange. This was made on the Hopi Mesas in the late 1200s. This is the local pottery called Winslow Orangeware that was made in Homol'ovi, basically at the same time. Same color, same design layout, and they have the same banding lines. So we would argue that more than likely people coming from Hopi with this technology of how to make pottery were the ones that were making the local pottery at Homol'ovi. Same thing with corrugated styles. There are two styles of corrugated pottery. This parallel style where the ridges are parallel versus one that's oblique. This one is made to the north. This one is a southern style, brownware tradition, grayware tradition, Hopi tradition, Magyar tradition. And these are vessels. This is the parallel style, and this is the oblique style. So two very different ways of making pottery that persisted all the way through the occupation of the Homol'ovi villages. 28% of the corrugated pottery is of this style, 72% is of this style, northern. Also, we have what are called slaughter polychromes, which is a late tradition made by probably Kayenta people migrating down into this area and farther south. Gila and Tono polychromes are the names of these types. And we find them being manufactured at Homol'ovi, primarily at Chevron, because the style of decoration is exactly the style of Gila polychrome and Tono polychrome, but it's being made on local paste. This suggests that people making these types of pottery were living in the Chevron Pueblo and immigrated from the Silver Creek area. Kiva design, square or rectangular. This is a Hopi design. The loom holes and the way that the whole setup is done here with the fire pit and the deflector and ventilator. Show a Hopi or northern origin. This is what it would have looked like when it was being used. So these are the bases of two looms in this kiva. And this is an example of one that's actually very near Tucson, made by Hopi migrants into the San Pedro River Valley on the other side of the mountains from Tucson. Same thing, holes for looms, ventilator system, square. And this is a rectangular great kiva from Homol'ovi 3. This is typical of great kivas actually in the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico, and comes actually from the south. Typical Pueblo room, 2.5 by 3 meters, fairly small. And then layouts of the villages are very Hopi-like So in summary, this is what we think we have, the kiva design, the parallel corrugations, most of the pottery, the designs and layouts, decorated vessels, etc., suggests that commonality with groups to the north, which would be the Hopi communities, Hopi Mesa villages, while a few characteristics, adobe bricks, for example, and utility ware, maybe the rectangular great kiva, suggests that some of the occupants of the Homol'ovi villages actually come from the south or east, maybe 25 or 30%. And these are ancestral Zuni people. So this is where those immigrants are coming from. Regional exchange, cotton is the major engine of regional exchange. It can be grown in the Homol'ovi area because of the water and the long growing season. And we see material showing up at Homol'ovi, such as obsidian, a lot of petrified wood, marine shell, other things that come from outside of the villages of Homol'ovi. But the thing we find the most of is the yellow firing pottery. And it is ubiquitous after 1325. And after 1360, cotton production was going on in the Homol'ovi villages, but after Homol'ovi II arrives, we see a huge ramp up of production of cotton and import of yellow pottery. And these are the percentages in flotation samples of cotton that we find. You can see after yellow pottery shows up, it shows up in the 30 to a third of the samples, which is a very, very high number and indicates the cotton was very, very common, probably being grown in the floodplain. And all those looms that we see in the kivas were probably being used to produce cotton textiles. So a little bit about Jeddo yellowware. It's uniquely made in 8 villages on the Hopi Mesas. We know this from neutron activation analysis. And it was manufactured using coal as fuel. But rather than a reducing environment, which would cause gray or white wares, it was used in an oxidizing environment. So what were once white wares or even, well, white wares in the area at Hopi, because of this oxidizing and because of the coal, became yellow wares. They're much higher fired temperature. They have unique designs, and they were probably being made by specialists. Production was way above the needs of the people in these communities. And we estimate 100,000 yellowware vessels were traded from these Hopi villages, again, 60 miles away, to Homol'ovi over the 75 years of its production. These are decorated primarily, but there are also utility wares as well. And we've seen this before, but these are just good examples of the sizes. They're also pretty uniform in size. There are 2 different sizes, which would nest, which would make it easier to transport them together. This is a jar that we found in the floor at Chevron. So again, the import of the yellow pottery increases substantially, and there's almost no local production of decorated pottery. And that could be because there's really not a lot of fuel maybe anymore after using the driftwood and the cottonwood, and it may need to be imported just to preserve fuel. One of the most significant and exciting things that we learned about in Homol'ovi villages was the appearance of Kachina religion in the villages. We see Kachina faces depicted in rock art, on pottery, and in kiva murals. These begin to appear together about 1360 or so when Homol'ovi II is founded. We see changes in the size of villages. Homol'ovi 2 has 1,200 rooms. Other villages get larger at this time as well. The layout of villages changes. We see plazas being built, large plazas. We see kivas being built into these plazas, which means the kivas are not associated with specific groups or tied into specific families. In addition to being in large plazas and kivas incorporated into the design of Homol'ovi 2, you see them added to existing villages, for instance, Homol'ovi 1 and Chevron. We also see correlations with changes in cuisine and feasting. All of this is happening when we see village growth exploding, and they need to absorb immigrants into these communities. So these are some examples of what are related to Kachina religion. These are petroglyphs near Homol'ovi 2. This is the Kachina Bowl, Snow Maiden Kachina. This is a painting of the San Francisco Peaks, mural on a kiva at Homol'ovi 2, San Francisco Peaks, which one can see from Homol'ovi, Winslow, is considered a home, or one of the main home and one of the many homes of Kachinas. Hopi viewing this and basically agreeing that these are the peaks and that their importance to the people of Homol'ovi as well as the Hopi today. So this is what I call an inclusive space where Kachina and other religious practices are planned, maybe a lot of the secret parts of ceremonies are performed, and then the public performances in these plaza spaces, such as this, Kachina dances. So those would have been probably going on in these large plaza spaces with the whole community observing, involved in planning, participating, cooking, and other things such as this. We see as the development of these plazas and Kachinas iconography showing up, begin to find Piki stones and development of new foodstuffs, starting off with comals, and eventually be changing from ceramic to stone griddles. And these cooking stones initially were used for tortillas, as you can see, 6 tortillas here, but eventually for the making of piki later on, which is a primary ceremonial food at Hopi. We found a ceremonial, women's ceremonial corner, we think, in the northeast corner of the big plaza of Homol'ovi 1, where there is a kiva, mealing room, and a piki house all together. So we have piki houses that probably look just like this, except they were cooking tortillas. And finally, structural fire. We found one of the villages, Chevron, was basically burned. The entire community was burned. Very different from many of the other villages. This is corn, room full of stored corn being burned, beams being burned. So we were curious about how people burn their structures and whether we could tell whether it was on purpose or not. So we decided to build some experimental rooms the same size as those at Chevron, and with the help of a couple of FBI arson investigators, we set up all kinds of experiments, and we experimentally burned the roof of this structure using a number of different fuel sources. And this involved a high school program that we involved in this, and they had a great time. But this is after the major burning. And so from that, we developed a number of tools to help us document better how these roofs were burned. And we noticed there was soot on the walls of one of the rooms going up this way. This is the depth of burn on the logs, the roof beams, very dark and all the way through here. and partway through here and unburned here. We also found that the floor of the room that was burned was heavily oxidized, meaning it was very hot. So all of these indicators through discussions with the arson investigators indicated that this was probably the ignition point, and that almost certainly the people at Chevron purposely burned their rooms, including rooms that were no longer being used, and that this was a method of closing the village of Homol'ovi, of Chevron. And upon its closure, along with the other villages, the occupants probably moved to Hopi, and with some going to Chevron. So this indicates where people, descendants of Homol'ovi people, are today. And just quickly, of course, couldn't have done a lot of this interpretation and a lot of this work without the close involvement of the Hopi tribe, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office since 1989. We've had the involvement of not only HCPO, but lots of Hopi student volunteers. They have consulted on human remains. We've had visits by tribal elders and just Hopi individuals, presentations of to our students and faculty by Hopi anthropologists, and a couple of NSF grants to focus on the recruitment of Native students to participate in STEM projects, and then an exhibit that we put together along with the HCPO, which you can still see most of it if you go to Winslow before the January of next year. It's still present there. And I went a little long, but thank you so much for listening. And hopefully we have 8 questions, so that's good. Thank you very much. And these are all the people and granting agencies that have made the work possible.
Chuck, thank you very much. That was so interesting. I have to apologize. I forgot to give your biography at the beginning of the talk. An apology to you and to the audience, but to do a little bit of that now. Chuck is just retired from the University of Arizona after 35 years of archaeological research in the middle little Colorado River that he's been talking about tonight. When he got his PhD from the University of Colorado, he went to work for Northern Arizona University, and that led to a big project that he did at the Hopi First Mesa village of Walpi. He and I were discussing that just as the program came on live tonight. And he was also really important in the history of Crow Canyon. From 1983 to 1985, he was the first director of research at Crow Canyon. Chuck's published more than a dozen books and over 100 articles and book chapters. And he's had a recent book that just came out this year that he co-edited with Barbara Roth, and it's titled Agent of Change, The Deposition and Manipulation of Ash in the Past. So apologies for getting that, but what a great career.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. And I must say that it took an unbelievably exceptional offer from the University of Arizona to drag me away from Crow Canyon.
Well, you got us.
Spent my entire life there, but they made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
Yeah, well, we were lucky to have you to get us started at both the Duckfoot site and at Sand Canyon Pueblo. So you left an important legacy here. Thank you. So there are a lot of questions. There's one that I missed this. It came from the very early part of your talk. So I'm not exactly sure what this question is referring to, but it says, what do you make of the fact that the Field Museum issued no report? Have you seen their collections from these excavations? I missed which excavations that's referring to.
It was by a guy named Dorsey in the early 1900s or late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, I think it's very unfortunate. I've seen the collections. They're primarily pottery, have been documented by Kelly Hayes, Gilpin, Wes Bernardini, Patrick Lyons, a number of scholars have actually documented and published to some degree on the pottery collections there. But, you know, Dorsey primarily just dug up some burials and bought a huge collection from the sheriff of 3,000 pots that the sheriff had accumulated, Sheriff Watron. And he was mostly interested, I think, in just filling up his museum. So we're very lucky that Fuchs was so prolific and wrote things up, and we at least know a little bit about what he did there.
Thank you. You went over this, but somebody asked for clarification on what you mean by tree ring dated pottery.
Okay. Once tree ring dating was established in the late 1920s, what archaeologists are able to do is, if they're fortunate enough in a site that they're excavating, to recover wood, either burned wood or in places such as cliff dwellings, unburned wood. That wood is sent into the tree ring lab and dates are assigned to that. Well, in those sites, there are also collections of pottery that come off those sites. And so if you look at the array of what we call pottery types, the designs on those types and things such as that, and you look at enough of those collections from sites that have tree ring dates that overlap, you begin to get a strong sense of when certain pottery styles and types were being made on the basis of the associated tree ring dates from those sites. So many sites such as Homol'ovi don't have the luxury of actually having tree ring dates, but we can use that pottery that has been dated by association of tree ring dates elsewhere. We can use the pottery that we find on Homol'ovi sites as a de facto way of dating, at least within a range of the production of that pottery type. So that's called tree ring dated pottery. And it is used all over the Southwest. That's how we date survey sites that we find collections on the surface. Archaeologists have worked in here for a while, can look at a collection of artifacts on the surface, especially in a place like the Mesa Verde, Southwest Colorado area, and tell within 25 years of probably when that site was being used. So it's that's what tree ring dating is. Hopefully that made sense.
Well, that was great. That's a great explanation. Thank you. So 3 people wrote in with a similar question, which is, I'll read one of them. What is the logic of building the villages at Homol'ovi in close proximity to the river that had seasonal floods? Wouldn't the floods cause significant damage to the villages?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't mention this, but with the exception of Homol'ovi 1, and I don't really have a good view of these, unfortunately. The exception of Homol'ovi 3, all of them are built on hills or mesas adjacent to the river. It's not obvious in looking at the map that that's the case, but Jackrabbit, Chevron, Cottonwood Creek, Homol'ovi 2 and Homol'ovi 4 are all on mesas that are anywhere from probably 75 feet to 125 feet high. Homol'ovi 1 is on a hill that's about 30 feet high, but as they expanded, it came down in the floodplain. Homol'ovi 3, for some reason, I guess they were like people today who built in the floodplain. They were just sure it was never going to flood again. But by building in the floodplain, Homol'ovi 3 actually was flooded. When we excavated there, we found deposits of mud on the floors and the kivas that was 20, 30 centimeters thick.
Wow.
And so it eventually forced them out. The Homol'ovi 3 people we are pretty sure moved to Homol'ovi 1 and settled there. So good question. I didn't explain very well that they took advantage of those buttes, those homoles that are all over the place.
And was it Homology 1 where they did the raising in order to make it higher? And how did they do that? Somebody asked, how did they do that? Did they infill the lower story rooms, or?
No, they built it up before the rooms were built.
I see.
So they all the fill was brought in, and then once it was raised 2 meters, then they began construction of rooms.
That's a lot of dirt to move a basket load at a time.
27,000 cubic meters. Yes, it probably, the pottery that we find, the trash deposits we find, span a period of at least 30 years. So, you know, they may or may not have been planning to expand the village, but they would been leveling that out for a long time. And then there was a big push adding quite a bit of material that last probably 5 years or so before they expanded it. They didn't build it all at once. They built the area north here nearest the upper village and then added on to that over the subsequent period of time. But I'm pretty sure they got flooded out from time to time anyway, as the flood of '93 demonstrated.
Yeah, thank you. So here's a question that I think you answered in your talk, and the question may have been submitted before you got to this part, but I'm going to read the question anyway, and I'm going to answer it to see if I got your talk right, and you can tell me if I got it right.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm not sure I will. Could you tell the origins of the Homology village founders? And I believe that's where you showed the differences in the types of artifacts and how they were made, and that you argued most of the founders were coming from the north in the area of the Hopi Mesas, but that maybe 25% came from the south. Is that right? You
get an A+, and here is the slide that summarizes that. Yes.
So I'm curious, if you went to the Hopi Mesas and found sites that were occupied at the same time or earlier than the Homology villages were founded, do they also have those connections and migrants from the south at the Hopi Mesa villages?
Yes, they did. You find adobe bricks at Wadabee, for instance. Mm-hmm. And you find some of the villages have a lot of Mogollon brownware pottery. Mm-hmm. So there are, it's not been studied enough. Wes Bernardini's been trying to collect some of that information. But some of the excavations summarized by Watson Smith and others of the ceramics of Wadabee clearly show that there are presence of people making brown pottery or using brown pottery. It's not nearly as much as what we find at Homology, though.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and just take all the rest of the questions, and folks can leave if it's gone on too long. We had over 200 folks attending tonight, and we've still got over 150 tuning in. Real quick, could you remind us of the Arizona land exchange in the past 20 years involving Hopi sites? Someone wanted to know. I'm unfamiliar with that.
I'm not sure what that refers to.
Okay, we'll come back. I got another question that said, I'm very interested in the rock art ranch work. Where can I find out more about that?
They have a website, the Rock Art Ranch. You can just type in Rock Art Ranch and it'll bring up information, phone numbers, how to get on a tour. They do tours every day, I think at 10 o'clock, except Sunday. You just need to call them up and say you'd like to go on a tour, and that's all it takes. You'll drive your own vehicle.
I was lucky enough to do one of those tours, and it was a great day. Really interesting. Some of the most amazing rock art I've ever seen.
Yeah, we hope to have it was mentioned very briefly at the beginning. I mean, it was in a slide. We did 6 years of field work there, and we hope to have a publication on that next year that will summarize not only the work that we did there. We actually found a huge archaeological record going back to Clovis there, but also a really nice summary of the petroglyphs there too.
And what would you say is the relationship between the sites that you worked on at Rock Art Ranch and Homol'ovi?
We excavated two pueblos, small pueblos. The one that's closest to the Homol'ovi area had only 4 rooms, but we got 5 really good radiocarbon dates off of corn that dated the Pueblo as between 1225 and 1255. And the Pueblo is dominated by brownware and Seabolt whiteware. So these people are coming from the Silver Creek area, Sholo, the south. They are only about 6 kilometers from Chevron, 3 miles, 4 miles from Chevron. The sites are a little early for Chevron, but I would say that it's possible that, the dating of these things, it's because they're only about 30 years apart. It's possible that the people at these little villages ended up at Chevron. Certainly the next generation or 2 generations after that did end up at Chevron because it has 40% of the utility ware at Chevron is brownware.
Thank you. Okay, it's 5:23. I'm going to go to 5:30 and then call it an evening, if that's all right with you.
It's only 4:30 here, so
there you go. Somebody asked if you can draw comparisons between Homol'ovi and shoe fly ruin.
They're occupied about the same time. Shoe fly is a Zuni, ancestral Zuni site. Their shoe fly is about the same size as Chevron, and they're contemporary. It's possible that some of that Roosevelt redware I went past it, I guess.
How far apart are they?
Roosevelt redware that we found at Chevron could come from people around the shoe fly area, this stuff. This is what they were making there along with White Mountain redwares. So we see that traded in. I'm sure these people knew each other and traded with each other. The people at shoe fly would have gone to Zuni. And so some of the people at Chevron might have ended up there as well. But for the most part, they went up to Hopi and the shoe fly people went to Zuni.
Somebody who did a site visit 2006 to 2007 says that they remember a site that had a buried effigy raven and also perhaps an effigy rabbit or hare, and wondered if you remembered that and what site it was.
No. I mean, I know they have found various effigies in Upper Little Colorado sites and Silver Creek sites, but I don't know specifically which ones. I think Table Rock Pueblo had a bear effigy that came out of it, which is near St. John's, Arizona.
It's hard to dig up languages, but somebody asks if the folks at the Homol'ovi sites likely spoke Hopi or some variant of Uto-Aztecan, or would they have been
almost certainly they spoke Hopi because almost certainly the vast majority of them came from Hopi. assuming that the people in the Hopi villages were all speaking Hopi. There's some debate and dispute about what people on the mesa that's no longer occupied, which is called Antelope.
Mesa.
Some believe that those were not Hopi and that they came from the east. So, but I think the simplest answer is they certainly spoke Hopi, even if it wasn't their first language, and their descendants are at Hopi today.
The questions keep coming in, so I'm afraid I'm not going to get to all of them, and I'm going to give you one last question. And it is, what is the ceremonial relationship between the Hopi villages on Hopi Mesas and Homol'ovi? And I would add on to that my question of, do Hopi people have specific histories that link Homol'ovi and their villages at Hopi?
I'll answer the second question first. Yes, that's how Fuchs was led down to Homol'ovi, is because people at First Mesa, where he was staying at the time, told him about these ancestral villages from a number of the clans. If you look at the work by Fuchs, I think he lists about 15 clans that are associated with Homol'ovi, that consider that to be one of their ancestral homes. The last place that they stopped before coming up to Hopi, they came from a number of other areas into Homol'ovi. In terms of religious practices, the only thing that we really know enough detail about is the Kachina religion. And I think that the Kachina religion at Homol'ovi was imported from Hopi. And I think it was probably pretty similar to the way it's practiced today. Obviously, it's changed some. But from the archaeological evidence with the plazas and the kivas and the faces and things, Kachina faces, showing a number of different Kachinas. Certainly the major tenets of Kachina religion were brought to Homol'ovi, probably when Homol'ovi II came and was built. But I would say Homol'ovi I, which was certainly the most important village before Homol'ovi II arrived, had a broad range of rituals and religious practices, probably most of them that were still present historically at Hopi. We just don't have the physical evidence to prove that, but it would make sense that it would.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Chuck, the chat has several people that have written in thanking you and saying what a great talk you gave. I want to thank Dylan Schwint, who was the technical person behind the scenes for Crow Canyon making this webinar happen. Want to thank the Hisatsinom chapter again for co-sponsoring this talk, and especially thanks to you for taking the time to deliver such a great webinar for us today. So,
my pleasure. Thanks to everyone for participating. Thanks for all your questions. You can find an email address for me if you want to email me a question. That'd be easy to do too.
Great. Maybe we can help provide that to folks when
I'd
we
be happy to answer questions by email. All right. Take care, everybody.
You doing that.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
You. Yep. Have a good evening. Great
You
to see
too.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.